This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. We begin this week with a cattle market update from Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. He discusses the current state of the market and why producers might be slow to expand their herd. K-State beef specialist Sandy Johnson continues the show with information about nitrate toxicity, which is something cattle producers probably want to keep in mind when it comes to testing and feeding forages. Completing today's show is Joe Gerken, K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist. Joe talks about why people should keep an eye out for duckweed in their ponds and how it can be managed. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show this week with a cattle market update. And this time we're joined by Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. Derrell, thanks for joining us today.
You bet. Good to be here. Starting
off our conversation about the cattle market with, what is the cash cattle market looking like?
You know, cash cattle markets, fed cattle are just, they're remaining fairly strong, kind of moving sideways here through the heat of the summer. I think there's opposing forces here. It's kind of the summer doldrums on the one hand, but certainly there's general tightness in the market that's keeping it supported. So we probably have a couple more weeks of this kind of summer doldrums before we start to think about kind of how the fall markets will evolve here.
And what about the futures contracts?
Futures markets, of course, they've been volatile as they always are, particularly with the grain markets being particularly volatile. That affects the feeder cattle market a bit more than the fed cattle market. But, again, general strength in there, reflecting the longer-term, uptrend in these markets.
Once again, our last portion we always talk about is box beef cutout. So what are we seeing there?
The box beef market for the last month or so, just about 3 weeks anyway, has been moving mostly sideways, just kind of bouncing around in that low, for choice box beef, 300 to 303 or so, 304. It's hanging in there just on a day-to-day basis, up and down a little bit. Again, kind of moving sideways, I think, through the heat of the summer here. We may see a little bit more of a push here in the next week or two as we think about getting ready for sort of the Labor Day, the last grilling holiday of the summer. I wouldn't be surprised to see it strengthen a little bit more here. But right now, just kind of holding our own through the summer.
So right now, overall, pretty kind of stagnant cattle markets, not any big movements happening.
No, not a lot of movements. I think, again, because of the time of year, we're gonna kind of mark time here to get through the rest of the summer, and then once we get to fall, I think we'll see some new direction develop in these markets.
And something else for us to talk about today was recently got some trade data out.
Yeah, so the latest monthly trade data was issued last week, and generally what we've been talking about the last few months is it continues. Beef exports were down again this month. We're down about 11% for the whole year. Now, again, that's on top of record levels in 2022. And we sort of anticipated, we have anticipated all year, really, that beef exports would probably pull back a little bit from those record levels. We have less beef. Beef production is falling. We have higher prices in general. We've had a relatively strong dollar most of the time. That's a headwind for it. So all of those things kind of are to be expected. Now, I would point out that if you look at, year-to-date beef exports, we're still slightly above the previous 5-year average ahead of 2022. So, 2021 back 5 years, we're still above that. So we're not at bad levels of export, just pulling back a little bit from those record levels a year ago.
Talking about things kind of from the past, in 2011, 2013, we had a pretty significant drought, which is something I think you can call the recent drought we've had. And that's caused some herd reductions. And after reduction, eventually, we'll see some expansion. However, maybe seeing things a little bit slower from this drought recovery.
Yeah, I think so. We were watching that mid-year cattle inventory report for signs of increased heifer retention. We did not see that. Beef cow slaughter is down so far this year, but it's actually not down enough to suggest that we're really getting serious about herd expansion yet. And so, compared to that situation a decade ago, there's a lot of similarities, but there's also some key differences. And I think it has to do with the fact that we do have continuing drought. in many regions of the country that clearly, if it's not actually contributing to additional liquidation too much, it's certainly preventing those regions from having any possibility of turning around and thinking about stabilizing and expanding cow herds. And so, and some other areas that maybe that have improved a little bit and are maybe not in drought or not in as bad a drought at this point, but they still need some time to heal up. A lot of those pastures are in pretty tough shape and hay supplies are depleted. So I think producers are kind of taking it cautious from that standpoint before they get too aggressive here with any herd rebuilding plans.
So overall, just taking time to maybe spend a little bit of time recovering financially.
Producers have been through a lot of stress the last couple of years, high input costs, the drought areas, high hay prices have been a tremendous problem. And so, so some producers, one of the reasons maybe that we haven't seen evidence of holding heifers yet is just in the short run, producers need to sell heifers into these stronger markets we've got and generate that cash that's needed for some revenue recovery for some period of time. At some point in time, then I think they'll think about holding heifers, but right now maybe they need to sell them.
On the sense of selling, I mean, you mentioned input costs, which it's an uncertain market. We don't know exactly what's happening moving forward.
We still got a fairly high-cost production environment. Now, for producers in areas that use a lot of fertilizer, chemicals, and so on, some of those prices have moderated from the record levels last year. But overall, the cost of production is still relatively high, and I think producers, again, are somewhat wary that we could see this thing turn around. There's still a fair amount of uncertainty in some of these global markets that can affect those input supply chains as well. So producers are taking it a little easy. And one big key difference from a decade ago in terms of starting herd rebuilding is the fact that we're in a very different environment now with interest rates. We're in substantially higher interest rates. That's going to affect cost of production, cost of financing. Producers that need to purchase, heifers or cows to rebuild their herds will face a lot different situation relative to the financial implications of those decisions.
And Derrell, I know here in Kansas we've finally gotten some rain, but I really think this conversation hits home the fact that even though we've gotten some rain, that doesn't solve all of our issues.
No, it's a long process, and, we've seen some rains in some areas, and Oklahoma, generally speaking, it has improved a lot north and south of us up into Kansas. There's some improvement in some areas, but some other areas still struggling a lot with drought conditions. Down into Texas, in central Texas, there's a lot of drought. The Panhandle's in fairly good shape, much like Oklahoma, but the point, and it goes on into Nebraska and over into Missouri. So we do have some significant drought issues, and it's still early enough in the year, in the summer here, with the kind of heat that we're seeing that we could actually see these drought conditions redevelop. I think producers logically are being a little bit cautious about the potential for us to slide backwards, even in places where we've made some improvement. And
so what can producers be expecting looking into the industry right now?
Going forward into the fall, I think, all of these things were, hopefully the broader weather environment is that El Nino continues to develop and that increases the odds of improving conditions, but that maybe takes much of the rest of the year. So we're really setting up for better conditions next year, I think, than for sure better conditions even for the remainder of this year. So that's one issue. And then I think producers, once they kind of get out of the worst of those drought areas or drought situations, then can start thinking about a little bit more of an offensive plan, if you will. We've been on defense trying to get through this thing. I think we can now start to think about how we're going to take advantage of the strength that we've got in these cattle markets. And we expect that strength to continue. It will be extended a little bit because we are a little bit slow in rebuilding the herd this time.
And Derrell, then talking about cattle and having to feed them and care for them and input costs, what does it look for grazing wheat in the future?
In the Southern Plains, winter wheat, grazing winter wheat is an important stocker primarily activity, although it's also used for cow-calf. We have not had good years the last 2 or 3 years because of drought. Right now, at least in some parts of the Southern Plains where we have gotten some rain, we're situated a little bit better for the potential for early planting winter wheat, which is what producers who want the forage part of winter wheat are interested in. So, at this point in time, at least down in Oklahoma, I would say that the odds are pretty good. We're going to see more potential for producers who want to do that, to plant wheat early and have that additional feed resource going forward. Obviously, later on, there'll be a lot of questions about sort of the budget, if you will, for these stocker cattle. And, with the feeder price, the stocker price, I should say, is going to be very strong. So we'll have to do some budget work to see how it actually looks economically. But at least I think from the standpoint of the physical or the production environment, we have a chance for some decent early winter wheat planting coming up in the next 2 to 4 weeks.
Maybe producers should sit down and maybe run some numbers and figure out some game plans moving forward for taking care of their cattle and crops.
Absolutely. The time to plan is earlier rather than later. Look at what's out there. The futures market can provide a guide. Now, one of the other things I should mention is that lightweight calves, when we use the futures market, of course, we have to take into account the basis, the difference between cash and futures prices. And in these high-priced markets like we have now, like we had in 2014 and 15, the basis on these lightweight calves will get a lot wider. So if you use historical records, that's our base. That's our data for historical basis. If you look back to the 2014-15 period, you're going to find basis is a lot wider here, and it's been building this year for these lightweight stocker calves on the feeder cattle futures market.
Derrell, overall, for people looking forward, what's the first few things they should think about as we kind of are slowly exiting summertime?
We need to just obviously get the physical environment, our resource situation taken care of, get pastures healed up, get those hay supplies replenished. But then we can, again, start to think a little bit more proactively, if you will, a little more aggressively about what our plans are going forward, recognizing that we're going to be in these strong cattle markets, especially feeder cattle markets, as we go forward through the rest of this year and on through 2024.
Derrell, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us a cattle market update.
Thank you.
That was Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. We referenced his article Several Reasons for Slow Herd Expansion, which can be found in Oklahoma State University's Cow-Calf Corner newsletter. I will link it in today's show notes as well as a way to sign up for this newsletter. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by Joe Gerken with some information about duckweeds. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show now discussing something that cattle producers may want to take into consideration, which is nitrate toxicity. And in to talk about it, we have K-State beef specialist Sandy Johnson. Sandy, thanks for joining us today.
You bet. Glad to be here.
Talked a little bit about nitrate toxicity, and so why is that possibly a concern for some producers?
Right. Well, as a plant grows, normally it's going to have nitrates in it as it's building plant material and growth. And the problem comes when that plant is stressed. And that stress could come from drought or hail or frost, and even extreme insect damage, I suppose, could cause, we lose leaf material. And the plant is stressed. And so what happens is here the plant's trying to grow and all that nitrogen is trying to go somewhere, but it ends up getting stuck in the bottom part of the plant. And I'm sure a plant physiologist could be much more eloquent in describing that. But essentially the process gets slowed down and all that nitrates generally are in the lower part of the plant or stuck somewhere unable to build the proteins that it's supposed to. Now, when we think about feeding various forms of nitrogen to our cattle, a ruminant animal can use lots of different sources of nitrogen, but you can have too much of a good thing. And so while a ruminant animal can process that, when there's excess beyond what the rumen can process, goes in the bloodstream, well, what happens is hemoglobin is converted to methemoglobin, which cannot transport oxygen. And so we're concerned because no oxygen, no life, and the penalty for not knowing how high the nitrates might be in your feedstuff is the animals can die or they can lose pregnancies. So it's a high level of concern. We've dealt with it for years and years, but we just need to make sure we're aware of the potential and manage around it as best we can.
You're in western Kansas, so maybe not quite as much of a concern for you guys, but in drier parts of the state where there's still substantial drought, definitely something to take into consideration.
Right. And even, we've had some hail out here recently, which, can cause some issues. And so as we think about the range of conditions we might have, even if we're in a dry area, we could get a big rain shower and it would enable that plant to try and grow again. And that may actually increase the nitrates even higher. And so we need to be aware of these conditions when we think about how are we going to use these forages. If it's really dry in your area, the forage amount is limited. And so we're looking, we need to feed that forage somehow. So if it's hailed on or enough rain that the plant tries to go again, we want to think about sampling that forage before we harvest it, make sure that, and you might have to get a couple samples depending on the situation, because it could go up way even higher. It's trying to respond to that moisture. So when we think about sampling for nitrates, we have to be aware that the field can be highly variable. And so if we're trying to sample to determine, shall we harvest yet, it's always harder to collect standing forage, I think, and feel like, we got all this volume and how do we reduce it and get a good sample? But just understand that the more time you spend doing that, the better you'll feel about the answer that you get. Grabbing one or two stocks and sending those in might give you some really erroneous results. And so be diligent in your sampling.
And when it comes to harvesting, if there are still concerns, is there a way they can maybe help reduce the possibility of having nitrate toxicity issues for their livestock?
So the nitrates are going to concentrate in that lower portion of that plant. So raising the cutter bar is certainly one option. And so we want to consider that. And it's always a trade-off when we're really short of forage. How much do we want to give up? So you got to think about that. And part of that is how are you going to feed it? If you're a person that has some other forages that are not going to be high nitrates and you're able to mix and blend that well, you might get away with taking a little more off the field. But we're always concerned about leaving enough cover on the field as well in terms of wind, erosion, and just protecting that soil. So generally raising that cutter bar is a good idea. So if the other options we can think about is if we put it in sillet, the nitrates are generally reduced about 50% during the ensilling process, but you need to have good ensilling conditions for that to occur. And sometimes it's hard to get the timing of silage optimal during a drought, but just understand there'll probably be some reduction there. And with any of these things, we're going to test it before we feed it to make sure the best way to use it.
Sandy, you've mentioned testing a couple of different times, and there's importance of knowing where you're sending it and what kind of results you're getting back.
Right. People will call and say, well, I got my results back and it was such and such amount, and what shall I do with it? And what they have to understand is that different labs, there's a couple different tests that people use. So if you can't tell me what lab and what their scale is, I'll have a hard time helping you accurately, because the lab generally will provide information that relates to the tests they're using and the level of safety. So you should have that with your results. And myself or any of my other extension colleagues would be happy to help you interpret those and figure out how you're going to use that feed stuff. And, generally we can use that. There are cases when we have extremely high levels that trying to mix it, or, we have to feed such a small amount of it that it's beyond most people's feeding capacity to do that. So you want to be aware of those extreme conditions. But again, hopefully those don't occur very often.
And what cattle are the most susceptible to nitrate issues?
Yeah, so whenever we think about something that's going to stress the system, young and old, and particularly, pregnancy is also a stressor, all right? So young and old and pregnant are going to be most susceptible to issues with nitrates. A lot of times our growing cattle, we're including some starch in the diet, and that starch actually helps us use up some of that excess nitrogen. And, with any of our animals that we're having to use high nitrate feeds, what we know is that we can gradually work them up to higher levels. And so depending on what you have, you may be able to feed more of it down the road than what you start with. And just like whenever we change diets, we want to do that gradually. And this is a case where we would want to do that, but we also know that we can work them up a little bit higher than if we just started feeding them cold turkey. And, as we think about diet changes and how we might use this forage, thing to be aware of is if you have high nitrate feeds and you get into a storm and it's like, well, I need to go dump a bale out there. Okay, that's not the place to use that high nitrate bale because they may have been off feed related to the storm, and then you introduce this high nitrate feed and perhaps really get into a toxicity issue because of the amount on kind of an empty stomach, so to speak. So just be aware of those issues that we can use it, blend it in, work them up, but we don't want abrupt changes.
We've talked a lot about chopping the forages. However, what if you're putting the cattle out to graze on them?
Yeah, oftentimes if we're in a drought situation, the amount of forage there makes grazing look more attractive because the cost to harvest can be, the amount of forage versus the cost to harvest doesn't quite make it look economically feasible. So generally, the upper portion of the plant and leaves will not contain as much nitrates. And so if I'm considering grazing, then I'm going to go out and sample that field and the portions of the plant that I think I'm going to make them eat. And if I graze lightly, what are they going to take first? It's going to be the leaves and, the upper portion of the plant. And so I would sample those and see what that level of nitrate was in the upper portion. And then I may also take some samples that maybe go a little lower so that I kind of know, what's my risk factor in this plant, because, it doesn't cost much to get a nitrate test when you look at the value of the livestock you're putting out there. So, we can do some of those sampling things to help guide our decisions on how we use that. And I know that there's been years, not this year in Northwest Kansas, but years when we've had this puny, pathetic, dried up corn that we thought would be really high, and it was actually, it never got that far. So sometimes we're surprised what's out there when we actually go and test it. So as the plant matures, it tends to, it's using up the nitrogen we put in the soil, and it's where it's supposed to be and not concentrated in the base of the plant. But, we have all this range of growing conditions that can cause it, different variations of things to happen on where it is. And so sampling, get a good sample, send it off, use that information to make decisions.
Sandy, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about nitrate toxicity for our livestock.
You bet. This is an issue it seems like we need to visit about every year. And I know that for myself, I always have to, doesn't hurt to review the details and make sure we're not getting our P's and Q's confused. So
that was K-State beef specialist Sandy Johnson talking about nitrate toxicity. You can read more on this topic from a recent Agronomy eUpdate titled Nitrate Toxicity in Drought-Stressed Corn. I will link that in today's show notes, which, as always, you can find on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show with some more information from the Wildlife Department. And today we're joined by K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist, Joe Gerken. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back.
Today you wanted to talk a little bit about duckweed and how it may affect your ponds.
Yeah, so late in the summer, like where we're at, we start to see a lot of duckweed show up, and it kind of can just cover a pond really quickly. So it's in the genus Limna. It's an aquatic plant that grows. It's actually a really, really small plant, but it can grow really, really quickly. So you can identify duckweed if you pick it up, and it has roots, and it has generally 2 true leaves. And so really small. Each leaf is about the size of a pencil eraser. So it's a pretty small plant, but it grows really fast, and it grows mostly by budding. It can seed out, but it mostly grows asexually by budding off, and it can double in size in anywhere from like a day and a half to 2 days. And so you can quickly go from just seeing a little pocket on your pond to your pond being completely covered, and that can cause some issues for our pond water quality and the critters that live in it.
Joe, so really one of the major concerns is how fast it can spread across your pond.
A lot of people are going from just seeing a little pocket, it'll look like, 1 foot by 1 foot area, and they're like, oh, that's not really a big deal. But it reproduces, like I said, every day. So it can really quickly cover your entire surface of your pond.
And plants aren't the only thing growing in ponds, also fish.
Yeah, there's a lot of fish, frogs, We talked about snakes a couple weeks ago, turtles. So there's lots of organisms that are using the pond itself. What can happen is the duckweed can cover the entire surface, like I said, and that can block out sunlight. And so phytoplankton that are relying on that sunlight can no longer grow and live. They can die off, and that can cause issues with oxygen levels. We've talked a lot about oxygen. That's an important component for our ponds, but that can cause, fish kills where you see large amounts of fish die. It can make it uninhabitable for frogs, the turtles, the snakes, little bugs. We've talked about the importance of a lot of those little bugs that live in ponds. It can just really cause a lot of issues. So we see it's on the surface, but really controlling it is kind of an important thing to consider when we're thinking about ponds and our pond health.
So what are a couple of ways that people could control this?
So there's two main ways. The best thing to start with would be just mechanically removing it. So going out, there's a product called a parachute skimmer. It's basically a pool noodle with a net behind it. So if you have a big pond, you throw it out on a string, you slowly pull it back across the surface, and it collects the duckweed into the net. And you can discard of that. Make sure you take it out of your watershed. It makes fantastic. It's really nutritious, so it can make great compost. Some people have added it to feed. So there are a lot of uses for the duckweed itself. There was actually a study at Kansas State a couple years ago about using it for human consumption. So there's been some ideas there. I wouldn't recommend taking the duckweed out of your pond and munching on it, but that is something to look forward to or something to consider. Is there could be some value there. So mechanical removal, if you have a small pond, you can just get a pool noodle, push that across the surface of the pond, it collects it, make sure you take it out of the watershed. There's some herbicide applications as well, and so the main herbicide that you would use is called fluoridone. And so fluoridone, you need to mix it with some surfactants, so that'd be something you'd want to talk to a professional about first before applying it. But it can work really well, and it generally takes a couple treatments to kind of get it under control. So there is some hope. It's a lot easier to control when we have little pockets of it. So earlier in the season, when it starts to cover your whole pond, if we go kill it off all right now, that's going to use up that oxygen. So we think we're helping the issue, but when we're thinking about the critters in our pond, still might be a concern there as well.
And is there possibly kind of a cool way to apply the herbicides if you need to? Yeah,
so one of the neat things that we're seeing, there's a lot of, especially municipalities that are doing this. It can be fairly expensive, but drone application is kind of one of the neat things that we're starting to do. And so we've seen that in agriculture quite a bit. It's starting to move over into the aquatic side of things as well. Fluoridone deals with the water itself, so it has to build up to a certain level. It's not necessarily a contact, so you don't have to spray it on the plant. It more affects the water chemistry than the plant itself. But there are a lot of herbicides that have to touch the plant. And so these drones are a great option there where they can, cover the entire surface of the pond, where if you or I were standing on the side trying to spray out, we might only get out 10 or 20 feet or so. So the drones are a great kind of new wave of moving forward where we can think about covering the entire surface of the pond. Just a fun, neat way to apply the herbicide.
That was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.